Hey, how you doing?
Oh, hey, Matt. Just working hard. Hashtag living the dream. Hashtag rise and grind. Hashtag is it Friday yet? Hashtag living La Vida Loca. How are things with you?
Just having some Joe, you know. Hashtag living La Vida Mocha. Hashtag no coffee, no worky. Hey, I got some cookies for you. Hashtag homemade. Hashtag chocolate chunk. Hashtag show me the cookie.
Hashtag don't mind if I don't. Pretty good. Hashtag getting my cookie on. Hashtag I am the real cookie monster. Hashtag no.
Delicious, right? Hashtag did it all for the cookie. Hashtag LOL.
Hey, I heard Student Ministries had its blob last week. Hashtag youth group. Hashtag student ministries. How are things going? Hashtag real talk.
Blob went really well. We had a lot of students, great speaker, great music. Hashtag Josh Hobie experience. It would have been a lot better if we had more hashtag volunteers. Hashtag small group leaders.
This reminds me of the hashtag multiply by 20 movement. Hashtag reaching and equipping the next generation. Hashtag Star Trek the next generation.
Hashtag Captain Kirk. Hashtag Priceline. Hashtag travel deals.
Hashtag Spock. Hashtag live long and prosper. Hashtag set your phasers to stun. Hashtag set your phasers to fun. Oh.
Speaking of fun, volunteering is fun.
Hashtag we're all in this together. Hashtag everybody is greater than somebody. Hashtag we need you. Hashtag the community needs you. Hashtag Westwood Church is more about just going to church. It's actually about giving back as the church. Hashtag we can do so much more together. Hashtag what's next?
Since M20 was such a success, hashtag nailed it, hashtag swish, hashtag we can't stop,
Hashtag and we won't stop.
hashtag volunteer push,
Hashtag commitment.
hashtag true players for life,
Hashtag we run this.
hashtag youth, hashtag Kid City, hashtag weekdays, hashtag weekends, hashtag 18.
Hashtag 80s reference. Hashtag Mr. T. Hashtag lot of jewelry. Hashtag real haircut. Hashtag I pity the fool.
Hashtag theme song, bum 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 bum.
Hashtag classic.
Wrong A team.
Huh?
Hashtag attend team. Hashtag volunteers. Hashtag opening doors. Hashtag we're all in this together.
Hey guys.
Hey Josh, what's up?
Hashtag rip off. Hashtag Jimmy Fallon. Hashtag get out there and volunteer. Hashtag multiply me.
Build your kingdom here, let the darkness fear. Show your mighty hand, heal our streets